Doctors are alarmed. 7. Personal hygiene mistakes. Elderly. Keep making. You won't believe number 4. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for taking time not just to watch, but to take care of the body that's carried you this far. It was a look from his granddaughter that pierced deeper than words. A hesitant pause, a step back, instead of a hug. Walter didn't say anything at the time, but something inside him shifted. It wasn't the first time he had felt it. Just last week, his neighbor had nodded politely but didn't wave like he used to. And yesterday, his son had replied to his message with a one-word answer. None of these moments seemed like much on their own, but together they formed a quiet pattern, a distance that wasn't always there. Walter tried to brush it off. He told himself it was just how life worked. People got busy, grew older. He wasn't angry, but something didn't sit right. The setting was a modest home in northern Illinois, a neighborhood where lawns were still trimmed every Sunday, and the mail carriers still waved to familiar faces. The sun was soft that morning, bleeding gold through the living room curtains as Walter sat alone at the breakfast table, a steaming mug of tea untouched beside his notebook. Autumn was turning the trees outside into a riot of orange and rust. It should have been a peaceful time, but that quiet once, a comfort, now felt hollow. Walter, 73, had been a civil engineer before retiring a few years ago. He was the kind of man who saved receipts, tightened every bolt in his house himself, and remembered birthdays without reminders. His hands were steady, though a little slower now. His mind, sharp as ever, had begun to question not just others, but himself. Did I say something wrong? Did I forget something important? He had always prided himself on being the rock of the family. So why did it now feel like everyone was slowly stepping away? The main conflict was subtle yet powerful. A creeping sense of invisibility. It wasn't about loneliness in the traditional sense. Walter still saw people, still exchanged words. But it was the quality of those interactions that had changed. Less eye contact, less laughter, less time. It was as if a she-singness had placed a pane of glass between him and the world, and no one noticed. Or worse, no one cared. This wasn't something he could just fix with a phone call or a visit. It was deeper. And the worst part, he couldn't quite name it. He tried to adjust. He called his son more often, but the calls felt rushed. He offered to help neighbors with small tasks, but they politely declined. He even joined a community gardening group, thinking it might bridge the gap. But after 2 meetings and minimal conversation, he didn't go back. Each attempt felt like reaching across a growing divide with arms that weren't quite long enough. The emotional climax came one afternoon when Walter stood outside his granddaughter's school to surprise her. It was her birthday. He had baked her favorite lemon cake and waited hopeful. When she emerged laughing with friends, she saw him hesitated and then waved from a distance. No hug, no run into his arms like before. Just a wave. It shattered him in a quiet, invisible way. That night, the lemon cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, the frosting beginning to melt into the plate. That moment forced Walter to finally face what he had been avoiding. Something had changed, and it wasn't just in them. It was in him too. He wasn't connecting the way he used to. His routines, comfortable, predictable, were no longer enough to keep him close to those he loved. The world hadn't rejected him outright. It had simply moved on subtly, and he had failed to move with it. As the chapter closes, Walter sits once again at the breakfast table, the morning sun creeping across the tablecloth. But this time, instead of retreating into thought, he opens a blank page in his notebook and writes one question. What am I missing? It's not defeat. It's a beginning. Because sometimes noticing the silence is the first step in learning to speak again. And if you've ever felt that same quiet drift happening in your own life or seen it in someone you love, then maybe now is the time to listen more closely. Maybe now is the time to start turning the page. If this touched something inside, you don't scroll away. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, or leave a comment, because connection starts with a single word. It started small. That's what made it dangerous. Not with pain, not with panic, but with routine. Martin woke up the next morning, the same way he had for years. Same bed, same sag in the middle of the mattress, the same window view of bare tree limbs against a pale April sky. But something was different now. Something invisible had shifted inside him. Not his bones, not his muscles. Something harder to name. Awareness. The house was quiet as usual. He shuffled into the kitchen, bare feet cold on the linoleum floor. The kettle clicked on. The familiar rhythm of morning comforted him. A slice of toast, the creak of the old wooden chair. But as he reached for his usual chipped mug, he paused. That whisper from yesterday, Dr. Ellis's voice was still there, tugging at him. Sometimes the body warns us in whispers. He glanced down at his toothbrush. Later that morning, still frayed, still the same one he'd used for months longer than he should have. He made a note to change it, but didn't. He told himself he'd buy a new one after lunch. Then he forgot. Again, Martin wasn't in denial. Not anymore, but awareness, he realized, wasn't the same as action. You could know a storm was coming and still sit on the porch. The truth was, he didn't know how to change. Not yet. That week, he began noticing more. When he clipped his fingernails, he saw the faint yellowing at the edges. His gums still bled when he brushed, but only a little. Right. Just a dab. He'd always been someone who prided himself on his independence, his memory, his ability to handle things. Asking for help had never come easily. But now, he noticed how often he skipped showers. Not because he was lazy, but because he feared slipping. The tub had grown treacherous. Some days, he only splashed water on his face and called it good enough. He'd never told anyone that. Not even his daughter Claire, who called once a week. What was he supposed to say? I'm scared of my own bathroom. The conflict was growing quietly within him. One evening, as Martin folded towels, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Delgado from next door, a retired nurse in her 60s. She smiled, holding out a small container of homemade lentil soup. For you, she said, in case you're not up for cooking. Martin took it gratefully, but inside something stung. Did he look like he couldn't manage a meal, Later, while eating her soup alone at the kitchen table, he couldn't shake the feeling. The little signs, the missed calls, the awkward silences from his granddaughter, the gentle offerings from neighbors. They weren't nothing. They were reactions to something he had been blind to. Maybe his habits weren't just personal. Maybe they were affecting the way others saw him, his dignity, his strength, his place in the world. He thought back to his last checkup, to the subtle way Dr. Ellis had softened her tone, how she avoided eye contact when discussing kidney function, the way her voice lowered when she mentioned a few lifestyle adjustments. Had she seen this coming? Had she expected him to ignore the warning? That night, Martin couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart thudding with something unfamiliar. Shame, regret, fear. Probably all three. In the stillness, he finally admitted it. He had let himself slip. Not out of laziness, but because it's hard to admit when life has begun to outpace you. That was his quiet defeat. But in that surrender, something else stirred. At 3:17 a.m., he stood in the bathroom, facing the mirror. The man looking back at him didn't look sick, just tired. Tired of not knowing what was next. Tired of wondering if tomorrow would be harder than today. But now he had a choice. Martin opened the cabinet, threw away the old toothbrush. He washed his face slowly, thoroughly. He changed into clean clothes, even though it was still hours until sunrise. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He wrote a list, a simple one. Things I will change. The first item, hydrate every morning. The second, replace toothbrush every 3 months. The third, ask Claire for help with installing handrails in the bathroom. He didn't know what it would take to change everything, but he knew he had to begin. In the morning, he would walk to the drugstore, not for groceries, just a toothbrush, a proper one, and that he thought would be a start, because ignoring the signs had gotten him here, but noticing them, that just might get him back. And you been noticing? Or are you still brushing off those little signals in your routine, telling yourself it's just normal aging? You have to ask yourself, what if it's not? The sun had barely risen when Walter found himself staring at the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, unmoving. There was nothing new in his reflection. The same crow's feet, the same thinning hair, the same steady eyes. But today, they stared back at him with a strange urgency. For the first time, he saw not just the details of aging, but the accumulation of silence. The distance he felt from others wasn't just happening outside of him. It was there in the mirror too, a reflection of his own withdrawal. The bathroom was silent, except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Walter set the toothbrush down and took a deep breath. He walked back to the kitchen, where the lemon cake from his granddaughter's birthday still sat now covered and pushed to the corner of the counter. He didn't have the heart to throw it away, but that morning he did something different. He uncovered it and sliced a small piece. Then he sat down, notebook open, and stared at the question he had written. What am I missing? Walter's story was no longer just about loss. It was about choice. He had spent his life waiting for people to come to him, speak to him, need him. But perhaps now, in this next chapter, it was his turn to reach out, not out of desperation, but out of courage. That realization sat with him like a second heartbeat. It wasn't enough to notice the silence. He had to respond to it. He made a list, just a few names to start his old friend Richard, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. The neighbor with the disabled son who once asked for help fixing a fence. The community garden coordinator whose number he still had. He underlined each one. Then slowly, carefully, he circled the name at the top. Richard. Later that day, Walter dialed a number he hadn't used since before his retirement. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Older, raspier, but unmistakable. Walt. Richard sounded surprised. Then came a silence. It's been a while. Too long, Walter said. And the conversation that followed wasn't perfect. There were pauses, awkward, chuckles, memories, half remembered, but it was real. And it lit something inside him. The next day, Walter showed up at the community garden with a pair of gloves and a small bag of lemon seeds. No one asked why he was there, no one had to. He just started digging. That week, something began to shift. The mail carrier lingered a second longer to chat. The neighbor's son waved back. His son's next message had a smiley face at the end. Small things, but not invisible. The mirror still showed the same man. But Walter had learned to look past the wrinkles, past the years, and see something else. Someone still capable of beginning again. And that was enough to change everything. As this chapter closes, he sits once more at the breakfast table, but this time, not alone. His granddaughter is there, legs swinging off the chair, a slice of lemon cake on her plate. She doesn't just wave. She leans in and whispers, I missed you, Grandpa. And Walter smiles. Not because the silence is gone, but because he finally found his voice again. If Walter's journey reminds you of someone you love, send this to them. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment to turn everything around. Walter didn't sleep well that night. He kept seeing his granddaughter's hesitant smile, the way she stayed close to her friends. Her arm barely lifting to wave. The lemon cake was still on the counter, untouched. In the quiet of the house, something inside him stirred. Not bitterness, but an ache that pressed on his chest like a slow, persistent tide. The next morning, he moved slower than usual. The sun filtered gently through the window, casting soft light on the worn kitchen tiles. The air smelled faintly of tea leaves and powdered sugar. Walter sat at the table, the same place he had always started his day, but this time there was a question scribbled in his notebook. What am I missing? He stared at it for a long time. Not because he didn't know where to start, but because for the first time, he was ready to admit something painful. He had stopped changing. The world, his family, even his own body. They had all evolved, but he had clung tightly to his routines, to his sense of pride, and now he was paying the price. A few days later, he made a decision. It was simple, but profound. He would listen, really listen. Not just to others, but to himself. What made him feel alive? What made him feel connected? That afternoon, he went to the community garden. Not to speak, not to fit in, but just to observe. He watched a group of seniors arranging flower beds and laughing over a crooked row of tomatoes. He didn't try to jump in. He simply stood in the corner, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back, the distant hum of conversation in his ears. One of the women, Anne, who looked to be about his age, noticed him. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she asked. He nodded. "A while ago. Didn't really stick?" "Well," she said, smiling gently, "sometimes roots take time to settle." That line stuck with him. Mine stuck with. That evening, Walter did something he hadn't done in years. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, not to shave or comb his hair, but to really look at himself. He noticed the fine tremble in his hands, the weariness in his eyes, the lines that told 1,000 stories. For a moment, he allowed the grief to rise. Grief not for what he'd lost, but for the time he had spent pretending he hadn't. That night, Walter opened a new page in his notebook and titled it, "What I Still Have." He wrote down small things: his hands, his voice, the love for his family, the ability to change, the courage to begin again. The next morning, he showed up early at the garden. Anne waved him over. "We could use some help lifting those pots," she said. Walter smiled, rolled up his sleeves, and joined in. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man being pushed aside. He felt like someone slowly stepping back into life. Later that week, he called his granddaughter, not his son, but her directly. He asked her about school, her favorite class, even the name of the friend who made her laugh so hard that day. At first, she was quiet, unsure, but then something shifted. She told him about her art project, her dog, a book she'd read twice already. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and Walter held on to it gently, not pulling, not pressing, just grateful. It was there as days passed. Walter kept showing up at the garden, in phone calls, even in small things like learning how to send a voice message. He wasn't trying to be the center anymore. He was learning how to belong again, not by demanding space, but by making space for others and for a new version of himself. One morning, he walked into the kitchen and paused. The notebook was open, and he read the last thing he had written. "Connection isn't what you remember. It's what you're willing to create today." Walter smiled. The world hadn't rejected him. It had simply waited for him to stop standing still. If you've ever felt like the world moved on without you, if you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt alone, know this: you are not finished. Change doesn't require perfection. It only requires a willingness to try. If this chapter touched your heart, pass it on. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that connection can be rebuilt one gentle step at a time. The sun had barely risen when Walter found himself walking the path behind his neighborhood, the dew still fresh on the grass, each breath drawing in the scent of pine and cold earth. It was a habit he used to enjoy years ago, when the world felt closer, lighter. Today, it felt like he was reclaiming something. The air was crisp with early spring. Birds flitted from tree to tree, their songs weaving through the silence in a way that made everything feel a little more awake. Walter wasn't rushing anywhere. He walked slowly, listening, feeling. His steps weren't as strong as they once were, but they were steady, and for the first time in a while, that was enough. He paused at the edge of the small lake, watching the ripples expand across the surface. It reminded him of something Anne had said during a break at the community garden just the day before. "You never know what ripples your presence makes, even if you don't say a word." Walter thought of that, now staring at the water. The choices he had made in the past few weeks had been small. A phone call, a walk, a note, a gentle question instead of silence. Yet somehow, those choices were beginning to change. His days, and maybe the days of those around him. For so long, he had measured strength by productivity, by holding everything together. But perhaps strength looked different now. He remembered how hard it was to make that first call to his granddaughter. His hand had hovered over the phone for a full minute, debating whether he should just text instead. But he dialed. And when she picked up and said, "Hi, Grandpa," with a softness he hadn't heard in months, something inside him had loosened. Their conversations were still short, but they were warmer. He asked questions, and she answered. Not always in full paragraphs, but enough to let him in. Sometimes she sent a photo of a drawing or a sleepy selfie before bed. He printed them out and stuck them on the fridge. They weren't declarations of love. They were breadcrumbs, and he followed them. One Saturday afternoon, Walter returned to the garden and found Anne tending to a new row of lettuce. She looked up and grinned. "Didn't think I'd see you twice in 1 week." Walter chuckled. "Neither did I." They worked side by side, not needing many words. At one point, Anne said almost casually, "You know, when you first came, you looked like someone waiting for permission to exist. Now you look like someone who knows he never needed it." That night, those words echoed in his mind. He thought about all the years he'd spent trying to prove his worth through work, through routines, through silence, and how all it took to start changing that was a willingness to show up as he was. Walter still had days where the silence returned, where he wondered if he was doing enough, being enough. But they didn't control him like before. Now he knew how to move through them, to call Anne, to water the garden, to open his notebook and write what he was grateful for. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. His granddaughter started calling him, not just replying, but initiating. She sent him a voice message one day. "Grandpa, I told my friend about your lemon cake. Can we bake it together next weekend?" Walter played that message 3 times. The next weekend, she came over. They baked. They laughed. She spilled flour everywhere. He didn't mind. When she hugged him goodbye, it wasn't hesitant. It was tight, real. The kind of hug that says, "I missed you." Later that night, Walter sat at the table, crumbs still on the counter, the smell of lemon lingering in the air. He didn't open his notebook this time. He didn't need to, because the answer to his old question, "What am I missing?" had finally come, not in words, but in moments. Connection, presence. A different kind of strong. Maybe you're reading this and wondering if it's too late to rebuild something. Maybe the distance between you and someone you love feels impossible, but let Walter's story remind you. Change doesn't require a grand gesture, just one step, one honest moment, one act of showing up. Even in the quietest chapters of our lives, something beautiful can begin. If this story gave you hope, pass it on. Share it with someone you care about. And if you're ready to start your own quiet chapter, let today be your first page.